She pressed both hands over her mouth to stop the sound from coming out. Not a cry, not a scream. Something worse, the kind of noise a woman makes when she finally understands that no one is coming. The dress was torn at the shoulder, the road behind her was empty, and the wolves weren't far. If you've ever felt invisible, thrown away, or told you were too broken to be loved, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, follow along to the very end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Yuck. Part 1. The stagecoach didn't slow down. It didn't even hesitate. One moment, Whiskey Larson was reaching for the door handle, her fingers curling around the iron latch, and the next she was standing in the middle of a Montana road with nothing but a carpet bag, a bruised wrist, and the sound of wheels disappearing into the dark. She stood there for a long moment. Just stood. The kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from shock, when the body hasn't yet decided whether to run or collapse. Then she picked up her bag. That was all she let herself do. Pick up the bag, square her shoulders, and begin walking. Her name wasn't actually Whiskey. Her mother had named her Margaret after a grandmother who died young and left behind nothing but a silver thimble and a reputation for stubbornness. But somewhere between Ohio and the Missouri border, a riverboat gambler had taken one look at her pale eyes and laughed and said, "Lord, girl, those eyes are the color of good whiskey." And the name had stuck the way nicknames do when they're more honest than the one you were born with. She was 26 years old. She had $14 sewn into the hem of her skirt. She had a letter of employment from a schoolhouse in a town called Redemption Creek, Montana, and she had not eaten since yesterday morning. That was the full accounting of her situation. She walked. The road was rutted and dry, and the summer heat hadn't broken even at this hour. She could feel the dust coating the back of her throat, taste it every time she breathed through her mouth. Her boots weren't made for walking long distances. She'd bought them second-hand in St. Louis because they were the only pair that fit, and the left one had a seam that bit into her heel with every step. She kept walking anyway. She heard the wolves before she saw anything. Just a single howl at first, somewhere to the north, answered almost immediately by two more. Not close, but not far enough. She adjusted the bag on her shoulder and moved faster without letting herself think about why. She was so focused on the road ahead that she almost didn't see the shape of him until the horse snorted. She stopped dead. There was a man on horseback, maybe 30 yards ahead, sitting still in the middle of the road, like he'd been there for hours. He was watching her. She couldn't make out his face clearly. The light was wrong, but she could see the width of his shoulders and the easy way he sat the saddle, like a man who'd grown up on a horse and never entirely gotten off. Whiskey's hand moved to the small knife she kept in her coat pocket. She didn't draw it, but she felt better knowing it was there. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then the man said, "You lose something, miss." His voice was low and unhurried. A Montana voice, the kind of voice that came from years of talking to animals and weather and silence. "No," she said. "Stage left you." It wasn't a question. She felt the heat rise in her face anyway. "That's my business." "Yes, ma'am." He didn't move. "I'm not disputing that." She stood her ground. She'd learned a long time ago that moving first in a situation like this was a mistake. You moved first and you were already running. "What are you doing out here?" "Heading back to town." He tilted his head slightly. "Same direction you're walking, looks like." "I don't need an escort. I didn't offer one." A pause. "I offered information. Redemption Creek's about 4 miles that direction. Road doesn't fork so you won't get lost. But there's a creek crossing about a mile out that runs high this time of year. And in the dark, if you don't know where the rocks are." "I'll manage." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "All right." He didn't move to leave. She noticed that. "What?" she said. "Nothing." But he still didn't move. She exhaled sharply. "If you're going to follow me to make sure I don't drown in a creek, just say so. Don't sit there doing it silently." Something shifted in the way he held himself. Not quite a smile, but close to it. Preston Hayes, he said. I run a ranch 2 miles east of town. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, Whiskey Larson, I'm the new school teacher. I know. At her expression, he added, Small town. Mrs. Patton at the boarding house has been talking about it for 3 weeks. She shifted the bag on her shoulder. Her heel was bleeding, she could feel it, now that particular wet warmth inside the boot. Fine, she said. You can ride alongside, but I'm not riding double with a stranger. Didn't ask you to, he said, and clicked his tongue at the horse, and they began moving. They didn't talk much on the road to town, which suited her fine. She asked him once about the creek crossing, and he described the rocks simply and clearly, without condescension, which she appreciated. He pointed out a stand of cottonwoods that marked where the road bent south, told her the cottonwoods meant water was close, and to cut left before she reached them. She filed the information away and said nothing. What she noticed, because she always noticed things, was that he rode slightly behind her rather than beside her, not hovering. Just positioned so that she could see the road clearly ahead, so that she was the one who could see what was coming. She wasn't sure if it was intentional or habit. Either way, it told her something about him. When Redemption Creek appeared first as a cluster of lamplight in the distance, then slowly as shapes buildings, a church steeple, she felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief exactly, more like the held breath you let out when you realize you're not going to fall. Boarding house is on the main street, Preston said. Mrs. Patton keeps a late lamp in the window for arrivals. Thank you, Whiskey said. The words were stiff. She wasn't accustomed to saying them and meaning them. He tipped his hat, not a performance of it, just a small, economical gesture the way a man tips his hat when he means it. Evening, Miss Larson. He turned his horse and rode back the way they'd come. She watched him for a moment. Then she picked up her bag and walked into town. Mrs. Violet Patton was a small round woman with quick brown eyes and an opinion about everything, and within 10 minutes of Whiskey's arrival, she had established that the stage driver was a scoundrel who'd done this to 3 other passengers that summer, that Redemption Creek had been without a school teacher for 5 months, and the children were running absolutely feral, and that the room on the second floor had a window that stuck, but the mattress was good. You walked the last 4 miles. Mrs. Patton said, setting a plate of cold beans and cornbread on the table without being asked. Yes? In those boots? They're fine. Mrs. Patton looked at the boots in question and visibly disagreed, but she had the grace to let it go. Preston Hayes, see you in. Whiskey looked up. He happened to be on the road. Mrs. Patton poured a cup of coffee and pushed it across the table. He happens to be on a lot of roads. Good man. Doesn't talk much, which is rare out here because most men won't stop. She settled into the chair across from Whiskey, with the comfortable authority of a woman in her own kitchen. You got family back east? No. Husband? No. You're brave then. Or stubborn. Probably both, Whiskey said, and ate her beans. Mrs. Patton smiled at that, a real smile, the kind that reached the eyes. I like you already, she said. You'll do fine here. Whiskey said nothing to that. She'd heard variations of it before, and it had never once turned out to be entirely true. Morning came hard and bright, the way summer mornings do in Montana. No gentleness to it, just sudden full light and the sound of a town already in motion. Whiskey dressed, wrapped a strip of cloth from her petticoat around her heel, and walked down to the schoolhouse. It was a single-room building at the edge of the main street, and the first thing she saw when she pushed open the door was that someone had written something obscene across the chalkboard in very large letters. She erased it without comment and wrote the date instead, July 14, 1876. The children arrived in 1s and 2s over the next 20 minutes. 14 of them ranging in age from 6 to 13. They came in loud and suspicious, the way children do when they've gone too long without structure, testing the edges of things, just to see what would hold. A boy named Tom Briggs, 11 years old, gap-toothed, already practicing the particular kind of meanness that would make him trouble. If someone didn't interrupt it, sat down in the front row, looked her over and said, "You don't look like a schoolteacher." "What do I look like?" she asked pleasantly. He thought about it. "Somebody who got lost." The class went quiet. A few children held their breath. Whiskey looked at Tom Briggs for a long moment. Then she said, "That's very observant. Most people take a week to figure that out about me. Open your primer to page 1. Tom Briggs blinked. She was already writing on the board. By noon, she had established that 3 of the children couldn't read at all, that 2 were significantly ahead of the others, and that Tom Briggs, under the aggression and the bravado, was actually one of the smarter students in the room. She filed all of this away. She would need it. At noon, she dismissed them for lunch, and she was sitting on the front step eating an apple that Mrs. Patton had pressed into her hand that morning when she heard footsteps and looked up to find a woman she didn't recognize standing in front of her. The woman was perhaps 50, dressed well for a frontier town, with the kind of careful posture that announced she thought highly of herself. "Miss Larson," the woman said, not quite a greeting. "Yes," Whiskey said. "I'm Adelaide Patton, no relation to Violet." She said Violet's name the way people say a word they've had to get used to. "I'm on the school board." "Good," Whiskey said. "I have some requests." Adelaide Patton blinked. Apparently she'd expected something else. "Requests. 3 children need individual primers. The ones they have are too advanced. I'll need chalk delivered weekly. The supply is nearly gone, and the stove needs a new flue before winter, or we'll all suffocate." She took a bite of her apple. "Nothing urgent today, but I'd like to address it before September." Adelaide Patton looked at her for a long moment. "You've been here one morning." "Yes." Whiskey looked back at her steadily. "Were you expecting me to need more time, Ging?" The woman left without saying much. But she left walking just slightly faster than she'd arrived, which Whiskey took as a reasonable first conversation. She saw Preston Hayes again on her 4th day in Redemption Creek. She was coming out of the general store with a list of supplies she'd purchased with the small advance Mrs. Patton had arranged against her first month's salary, and he was tying his horse to the post outside. He saw her the same moment she saw him. He straightened and touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Larson." "Mr. Hayes." She moved a step past him, and he stepped to the side to give her room without being asked, which was something not every man remembered to do. She stopped anyway. She wasn't sure why. "Thank you," she said. "For the other night. The creek information." It was nothing. It wasn't nothing. I'd have gone in over my knees in the dark. She adjusted the packages under her arm. "I don't say thank you for nothing." He looked at her. In the daylight she could see his face clearly for the first time, a face that had been outside in all weather for a long time, with a stillness to it that she was coming to understand was not distance, but economy. He didn't spend energy he didn't need to spend. "You settling in all right?" he asked. "Fine." "Mrs. Patton treating you well?" "Better than I deserve, probably." She paused. "She talks a great deal." "Yes," he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost barely humor. She found herself almost barely responding to it. "Good day, Mr. Hayes?" "Miss Larson?" She walked back toward the boarding house and told herself very firmly that there was nothing interesting about Preston Hayes. He was simply a man who had happened to be useful on a dark road. That was all. The frontier was full of men like that, capable and quiet, and ultimately of no particular significance to her. She told herself this very firmly. She didn't entirely believe herself, which was annoying. On the 7th day the letter came. Mrs. Patton brought it up with her morning coffee, set it on the table beside the cup, and said nothing. Which told Whiskey that Mrs. Patton had seen the return address and understood what it meant. She stared at it for a moment before she picked it up. The handwriting on the envelope was her uncle's. She would have known it anywhere that particular cramped script, each letter pressed down too hard, like the man himself. His name was Gerald Crane, and he was her mother's brother, and he had spent the past 2 years attempting to establish legal control over the small parcel of land her mother had left to Whiskey in her will. It was 40 acres in eastern Ohio. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And Gerald Crane had been contesting the will on the grounds that Whiskey, as an unmarried woman without fixed residence, was incompetent to manage property. He'd had 2 lawyers file 2 separate petitions. She'd fought both of them. She'd won both of them. She had not apparently won enough. She opened the letter. It was short. Gerald Crane's letters were always short because he put his energy into documents, not words. It said only that he had retained new legal counsel, that the matter of her mother's estate was not yet closed, and that it would serve her interests to return to Ohio and discuss the situation in person. At the bottom, in smaller letters than the rest, "I know where you are now, Margaret. Running doesn't close a legal matter." She set the letter down. She picked up her coffee. She drank half of it before she trusted herself to think clearly. He was right about one thing: running didn't close a legal matter. She'd known that when she left Ohio. She'd taken the teaching position not to run, but to give herself distance and time, and an income that couldn't be touched. A life built on her own terms, that a lawyer couldn't argue, was evidence of incompetence. But Gerald Crane had found her. That was faster than she'd expected. She folded the letter and tucked it into her coat pocket and went downstairs and taught school for 6 hours and came home and ate supper and said nothing to Mrs. Patton about any of it. That night, she sat at the small desk in her room and wrote to the lawyer in Columbus who'd handled her mother's estate. She laid out what Gerald's letter had said, asked for a clear accounting of what legal options remained, and wrote her return address in the corner with a firmness she didn't entirely feel. She sealed it, set it to send in the morning. Then she sat for a long time in the dark and listened to the summer wind move through the cottonwoods outside, and told herself very quietly that she had been in worse positions than this. She had. That was true. It didn't make the fear go away, but it reminded her that the fear had been wrong before, and that was something. She didn't tell anyone. She went about her days. She taught Tom Briggs to stop using his intelligence as a weapon and start using it as a tool, which was a slow process, but a real one. She learned that the child who sat in the back row and said nothing was named Clara, and that Clara couldn't hear well out of her left ear, and that nobody had thought to seat her on the right side of the room, and when Whiskey moved her desk, the change in the girl's face was immediate and complete. She bought a better pair of boots with her first salary payment. She saw Preston Hayes at the church social on a Sunday, and they stood side by side for 20 minutes watching Tom Briggs attempt to steal an entire pie, and neither of them said anything. But they were both clearly watching, and there was something companionable about it that she hadn't expected. Afterward he said, "How's the heel?" She looked at him. "You noticed that night you walked in, the way you were favoring your left side." She considered this. "Better," she said. "New boots." He nodded, like that was a satisfying resolution to a problem he'd been quietly tracking. "Good," he said. She walked home and spent a significantly unreasonable amount of time thinking about the word good and the particular way he'd said it, and she decided that this was a sign that she needed more sleep. The second letter from Gerald Crane arrived 16 days after the first. This one was not short. This one included a copy of a legal document, a petition filed in the Montana Territorial Court, not Ohio, claiming that Whiskey had abandoned the contested property and that abandonment constituted forfeiture. He'd moved faster than she'd thought possible. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table, and she pressed her hands flat against the wood to stop them from shaking, and she breathed slowly the way you breathe when you are trying not to let the panic have you. Gerald Crane wasn't just trying to pressure her anymore. He was trying to take the ground out from under her legally, in the state she'd come to, so that there was nowhere left to run. Her mother had been dead for 2 years. Her mother had been a small, quiet woman who had loved her fiercely and apologized for Gerald Crane her entire life, and died leaving Whiskey the only thing she'd ever owned. 40 acres and a deed and a name on a piece of paper. Whiskey picked up the letter. She walked downstairs. Mrs. Patton looked up from the counter and saw her face and asked no questions. "Is there a lawyer in town?" Whiskey asked. "Daniel Holt," Mrs. Patton said immediately. "He's over on 2nd Street. He's good, Margaret. He's genuinely good." It was the first time Mrs. Patton had used her real name. Whiskey nodded. "All right," she said. She walked out into the summer heat with Gerald Crane's letter in her hand, and she walked straight to 2nd Street, and she didn't allow herself to feel anything until she had her hand on the doorknob of Daniel Holt's office. Then she stopped, just for a moment, just long enough to let the fear come through her cleanly, without getting tangled in it. The way you let cold water come over you when there's no use fighting the cold. Her mother had left her 40 acres and a name on a deed. She was not going to lose it. She opened the door and walked in. Daniel Holt was younger than she'd expected. That was the first thing she registered when she walked through the door. A man, maybe 30 years old, sleeves rolled to the elbows, ink on 2 fingers, papers stacked in organized chaos across a desk that had clearly seen better decades. He looked up when she came in and read her expression, the way a man reads weather. "Sit down," he said, before she'd introduced herself. She sat. She put Gerald Crane's letter on the desk between them and said, "My name is Margaret Larson. I'm the new schoolteacher, and my uncle is trying to steal my land." He read the letter once, then he read it again. He didn't say anything while he read, which she appreciated. A man who filled silence with reassurance before he understood the problem was a man who wasn't actually listening. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her. "How long has this been going on?" "2 years. He filed in Ohio twice. I won both times." She folded her hands in her lap. "He's moved it to Montana Territorial Court now. I don't know anyone here. I don't know the judges. I don't know the procedures." "I do," Holt said. "That's why I'm here." He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way a man looks when he's calculating. "The abandonment argument is weak. You left Ohio for documented employment. That's not abandonment, that's relocation. A judge who knows property law will see that in 10 minutes. He paused. "The question is whether your uncle can get a judge who doesn't know property law or one he's already had a conversation with." The words settled over her like cold water. "You think he'd try to buy a ruling?" she said. "I think a man who's filed 3 separate legal actions against a woman over 40 acres of Ohio farmland isn't primarily motivated by the land." He looked at her steadily. "What does he actually want?" She was quiet for a moment. "Control," she said. "He wanted it over my mother when she was alive. She wouldn't give it to him. She left everything to me instead. I think he's never forgiven either of us for that." Holt nodded slowly. "Then he'll keep coming." "I know." "Which means we can't just win this petition. We need to make it expensive enough for him legally and publicly that he decides to stop." He picked up a pen. "Tell me everything. Start with the first Ohio filing." She told him. She'd never told anyone the whole of it before. The letters the lawyer visits the court dates the way Gerald Crane had shown up at her mother's grave 3 weeks after the burial, with a deed he claimed superseded the will. She told Holt all of it flatly, and without self-pity, the way you give testimony, and he wrote down what mattered and asked sharp, exact questions when he needed more. By the end of it, the light outside had shifted. She hadn't noticed the time passing. "All right," Holt said. He squared the papers on his desk. "I'm going to file a response within the week. You keep any letters he sends you. Don't throw a single one away. And Miss Larson." He paused. "If he comes to Redemption Creek in person, you come to me before you say one word to him. Not after. Before." She looked at him. "You think he'll come?" "A man who moved this to Montana court didn't do it to avoid traveling." He held her gaze. "He did it because he intends to be here." She picked up her bag. She stood. She was not going to let him see what that information did to her, so she let herself feel it fully for exactly 2 seconds, and then she put it somewhere she could deal with later. "Thank you, Mr. Holt," she said. "I'll send word when the response is filed." She walked out into the summer afternoon, and the heat pressed against her like a physical thing, and she stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment, just breathing. Then she walked back to school, because she had an afternoon class and Tom Briggs was working on long division, and she'd promised Clara she would bring a different primer tomorrow, and whatever Gerald Crane intended, she was not going to let it take anything she'd already built here. Not one thing. She didn't tell Mrs. Patton about Holt's warning. She told her only that she'd retained a lawyer and that the situation was being handled, which was true enough. But that night when she couldn't sleep, she lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and thought about the word before. Holt had said it like it mattered. She knew it mattered. She'd made the mistake before of thinking she could handle Gerald Crane herself, woman to man, plain speech to plain speech. She'd done it twice in Ohio, and both times he'd twisted what she said into something it wasn't and put it in front of a judge. She was not going to make that mistake a third time. She was still lying awake when she heard the sound. It was small a creak from the hallway, the particular sound of a floorboard that she'd already learned to identify as the third step from the top of the stairs. Someone moving carefully, trying not to make noise. She sat up. The sound stopped. Then, after a long moment, it retreated, slow, deliberate footsteps moving back down the stairs. She sat in the dark and listened until the house was completely quiet again. Then she got up and checked the lock on her door, which was already locked. Then she went to the window. The street below was empty. She stood at the window for a long time. In the morning, she mentioned it to Mrs. Patton, only as a question. Had anyone come in late last night? A boarder she hadn't met. Perhaps Mrs. Patton gave her a sharp look and said that she had 3 other boarders, all women, all of whom were in bed before 9 o'clock, and that if someone had been on those stairs, it wasn't any of them. Might have been the cat, Mrs. Patton said, but she said it in the tone of a woman who didn't believe her own suggestion. Whiskey nodded and said nothing else. But she moved her chair against the door that night. She saw Preston Hayes at the feed store 2 days later. He was loading something into the back of a wagon and didn't see her immediately. And she had a moment to observe him at work, the economy of it, the same quality she'd noticed before. Nothing wasted, every movement doing exactly what it needed to do, and no more. Then he turned and saw her, and she had the disconcerting experience of being caught looking. "Miss Larson," he said. "Mr. Hayes." She shifted her bag. "I need to ask you something." He waited. He was good at waiting. "Does this town have any trouble with strangers coming through and causing problems?" She kept her voice even. Not looking for reassurance. Looking for an honest answer. He studied her face for a moment. "What kind of trouble are you expecting?" "I don't know yet." She paused. "Maybe none. Maybe some." "Someone on those stairs," Mrs. Patton said, from directly behind Whiskey, which made her startle, because she hadn't heard the woman approach. Mrs. Patton was carrying a basket and looking at Preston with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for an opportunity. Whiskey turned. "Mrs. Patton." "She heard someone in the boarding house 2 nights ago," Mrs. Patton said, addressing Preston directly. "Moving on the stairs, late, slow." Preston looked at Whiskey. Whiskey looked at Mrs. Patton with the specific expression of a woman who would be having a word with her later. "Lock's good on the door?" Preston asked. "Yes." "You checked the window?" "Yes." He nodded. Something shifted in his expression, not alarm, not drama. Just a shift in attention, subtle and real, like a man who'd filed something away in a category he took seriously. "Town gets drifters this time of year. Usually they move on. But if it happens again, I'll handle it," she said. "I was going to say let Mrs. Patton know so she can tell Sheriff Oakes." He paused. "Not suggesting you can't handle yourself, Miss Larson, just that Oakes should know what's coming through." She looked at him. She was looking for condescension, and she didn't find it. "All right," she said. "Thank you." "Course." He picked up the last of the feed sacks. "Evening, Mrs. Patton." He touched his hat brim and climbed onto the wagon seat. Mrs. Patton watched him drive away with a satisfaction that she didn't even try to conceal. "That man," she said warmly. "Don't," Whiskey said. "I didn't say anything." "You were about to." Mrs. Patton smiled and walked in the other direction, which somehow felt like winning an argument. "Oh, Daniel Holt sent word on Thursday. The response to Gerald Crane's petition had been filed. The territorial court had assigned a hearing date 6 weeks out. That was faster than she'd hoped and slower than she'd feared. She read the note twice and then folded it precisely and put it in the same place she kept all the letters from Gerald Crane, an envelope in the bottom of her trunk beneath the spare blanket, ordered by date. 6 weeks. She could build a great deal in 6 weeks. She'd built something in 2. Already, a class that functioned, children who came in on time, a set of primers that were the right level for the right students. A reputation in town for being fair, and a little formidable, which was exactly the reputation she'd wanted. She could build 6 more weeks of that. 6 more weeks of being exactly who she was here visibly without apology. That was her legal strategy as much as anything Holt could argue. Nannyback. The trouble came on a Friday. She was locking the schoolhouse at the end of the day when she heard Tom Briggs's voice loud higher than usual and pitched the way voices get when fear is trying to disguise itself as aggression. She turned. There were 2 men she didn't recognize standing near the edge of the schoolyard. They were looking at Tom. One of them was saying something she couldn't fully hear, low and slow, and Tom was backing up even as he tried to make himself look like he wasn't. She walked over without deciding to. "Tom," she said, "go home." Tom looked at her with something complicated in his face, relief and pride fighting each other, and then he went fast without looking back at the men. Whiskey turned to face them. They were older than her, both of them, trail-worn, the kind of men who'd been a lot of places without settling anywhere. One was bigger. The other had eyes that moved too much, checking her, checking the street, checking the schoolhouse door. "Afternoon," the bigger one said. "Afternoon," she said. "This is the schoolyard. School's done for the day." "We know." His eyes moved over her slowly. "Just passing through. Didn't mean to spook the boy." "You didn't spook him," she said, which was a lie, and they all 3 knew it. Redemption Creek is that way. The road goes straight through. The one with the moving eyes smiled in a way that didn't touch anything behind it. "Friendly town." "It is," she said. "And it keeps a sheriff." A beat of silence. The bigger man looked at her for a long moment, assessing something, and she stood completely still and let him assess and gave him nothing. Then he shrugged. "Much obliged," he said, and they turned and walked toward town. She watched them go. Her hands were perfectly steady. The rest of her was not, but they didn't need to know that. She locked the schoolhouse door and walked straight to Sheriff Oakes. He was a weathered man in his 50s who had the manner of someone who'd seen most things and been surprised by very few of them. He listened to her description without interrupting and wrote down the physical details without being asked. "Moving eyes, you said. Checking the yard. And the street, like someone who knows a place before they arrive." He looked up at that. "That's a particular kind of observation, Miss Larson." "I'm a particular kind of woman," she said. "Are they trouble?" "Could be passing riders." He tapped the pen against the desk. "Could be something else." He paused. "You retained Dan Holt for something." She looked at him steadily. "A legal matter." "Anything that might bring someone out here looking at you sideways." The question landed squarely. She thought about Holt's warning he intends to be here, and she thought about the stairs in the boarding house, and she thought about those eyes moving over the schoolyard with the particular quality of reconnaissance. "Possibly," she said. Oakes set the pen down. "Then I'd appreciate you being straight with me because I can't protect what I don't know about," she told him. "Not everything, not the full history of Ohio, but enough. Gerald Crane, the petition, the timing, Holt's warning." When she finished, Oakes was quiet for a moment. "A man sending scouts ahead of himself," he said. "That's not a man who's scared of you. That's a man who's overconfident." "Yes," she said. "Overconfident men make mistakes." "That's what I'm counting on." He stood and extended his hand across the desk, which was unusual enough that she paused before she shook it. "You tell me the moment anything else happens," he said. "Day or night." She walked back to the boarding house, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not safety, she wasn't naive enough to feel safe, but something adjacent to it, something like not alone. Joe, Preston found out that evening. She didn't tell him. Oakes did. Apparently they were friends or something close to it. The particular friendship of two people who'd lived in the same small town long enough to have been useful to each other in hard moments. Mrs. Patton told her later that Preston had come by while she was upstairs, had talked to Oakes for 20 minutes, and had left heading in the direction the two men had gone. He went after them, Whiskey said. Didn't go looking for trouble, Mrs. Patton said carefully. Just went and had a look at where they'd stopped. And? They rode out before supper. Both of them. She stood in the kitchen and thought about that. Then she said, he shouldn't have involved himself. He didn't ask permission, Mrs. Patton said with a tone that suggested she thought this was reasonable. That's exactly what I mean. Margaret. Mrs. Patton set down what she was holding and looked at her directly. That man has lived in this valley for 8 years, and I have never once seen him involve himself in someone else's business unless he believed it mattered. That's not control. That's... I'll handle my own situation, Whiskey said. You are. Nobody said you weren't. Mrs. Patton picked up the dish towel again. But you know what the difference is between a strong woman and a foolish one. A strong woman knows when someone's worth standing next to. Whiskey said nothing to that. But she didn't sleep with the chair against the door that night. She saw him on Saturday morning at the edge of the market where the ranchers came in to trade. She crossed the street toward him before she'd entirely decided to. He turned when he heard her footsteps and waited. Those men, she said. Moved on, he said. I heard. She looked at him. You went out there yourself. Oakes was tied up. I had time. Mr. Hayes. She said it slowly. I appreciate the intention, but I need you to understand something. My uncle has been trying to take my land and my agency for 2 years. Every time a man stepped in front of me without being asked, even with good intentions, it made things worse. It gave the lawyers something to point at. It gave Gerald Crane ammunition. She held his gaze. I can't have people fighting battles on my behalf that I'm in the middle of fighting myself. He was quiet for a moment. He wasn't defensive. She watched him actually take in what she'd said, turn it over, understand it. That's fair, he said. I'm not angry. I know. You're explaining terms. A pause. That's fair too. She breathed out slowly. What did they say when you found them? Said they were passing through. Said nobody sent them. He paused. Said it too quickly. Men who aren't lying don't answer that fast. No, she agreed. They don't. If they come back, he said, I'll tell you before I do anything. That what you're asking. She looked at him for a moment. Something in her chest did a thing she'd rather it hadn't. Yes, she said. That's what I'm asking. He nodded once. All right. She started to turn away. Miss Larson. She stopped. For what it's worth, he said quietly, the way you stood in that schoolyard. Oakes told me. I've seen men twice your size fold under less. He paused. I thought you should know someone noticed. She faced forward and kept walking because it was either that or stand there in the middle of the market and feel something she wasn't ready to feel in public. She got half a block before she had to stop and look at the sky for a moment just to keep herself level. Then she kept walking. 6 weeks. She had 6 weeks to build a life solid enough that nothing Gerald Crane brought into that courtroom could touch it. She intended to use every one of them. The third letter came on a Monday. She knew what it was before she opened it. Same handwriting, same cramped pressure, same return address. But this one had been opened and resealed. She could see it at the edge of the envelope, a small tear in the paper that was too deliberate to be accidental. Someone had read it before she had. She unfolded it at the kitchen table, with Mrs. Patton watching her face. This one was different. No legal language this time. No petitions, just 5 lines in Gerald Crane's handwriting. You were always too stubborn for your own good. Your mother was the same way, and look where it got her. I'll be in Redemption Creek by the end of the month. We can settle this between family, or we can settle it in front of a judge. The choice is still yours, Margaret. For now." She set the letter down. Mrs. Patton said very quietly, "He's coming. By the end of the month." Whiskey looked at the torn edge of the envelope. "And someone here read this before I did." The kitchen was very still. She picked up the letter again, folded it once, and stood. "I need to speak with Daniel Holt," she said. "And then I need to speak with Sheriff Oakes and Mrs. Patton." She paused at the door. "Which of your other boarders is not a woman?" Mrs. Patton's face changed. "The man who came last week," she said slowly. "He said he was a surveyor. He left after 2 nights. She stopped. "He asked which room was yours." Whiskey stood at the door and let that settle into her bones. Gerald Crane hadn't just found out where she was. He'd already sent someone inside. She didn't run to Holt. She walked. Deliberately, steadily, the way you walk when every instinct in your body is screaming to move faster, and you refuse to let anyone watching see that, because someone might be watching. She understood that now. The surveyor had asked which room was hers. That meant the stairs at night weren't random. That meant someone had stood outside her door in the dark, knowing exactly whose door it was. That meant Gerald Crane had planned this with patience and precision before he'd ever sent a single letter to Redemption Creek. She pushed open Holt's office door, and he looked up, and whatever was in her face made him stand. "Sit down," he said. "I don't need to sit." "Miss Larson." The envelope was opened. She put the letter on his desk. "Someone read it before I did. Gerald Crane sent a man ahead of him. He was staying at the boarding house. He asked Mrs. Patton which room was mine." She paused. "He was in the hallway outside my door." Holt read the letter. Then he sat back and pressed 2 fingers against his mouth and was quiet for a moment that felt very long. "He's escalating," he said finally. "I know what he's doing. What I need to know is what we can do about it." The opened letter, that's mail tampering. Federal offense. He tapped the envelope edge. "If we can connect the man who did it to your uncle directly, that's leverage." He looked at her. "Did Mrs. Patton get a name?" "John Aldous. He paid 2 nights in advance, cash." Holt wrote it down. "I'll send a wire to the Ohio County Clerk. If Aldous has worked for your uncle before, there'll be a paper trail. Gerald Crane is a careful man, but careful men trust their own systems too much." He paused. "And Miss Larson, the letter itself. For now, that phrase." "It's a threat," she said. "It's a documented threat. In writing, signed." He looked up. "He just handed us something," she breathed. It was small, the thing she felt, not hope exactly, but the precise, functional opposite of despair. "What do I do between now and the end of the month?" "You do exactly what you've been doing. You teach school. You keep your receipts, your correspondence, your employment record clean. Every day you are visibly, demonstrably a functioning, competent, independent woman is another day. His incompetency argument loses ground." He held her gaze. "And you don't speak to him alone. Not for 1 minute. You understand me. I told Oakes the same thing." "Good. Then we're all reading from the same page." He stood and extended his hand. "We're going to win this." She shook it. "We'd better," she said. "Brusiag." She told Preston that afternoon. Not because she'd planned to. She'd gone to the feed store for chalk. The schoolhouse supply was almost out again, and he was there, and when he looked at her and said, "Something happened," it wasn't a question. It was a statement delivered so simply and accurately that she answered before she decided to. "My uncle is coming," she said. "He had a man staying at the boarding house. The man was in my hallway." She watched his face. "I need you to know because you're in this now whether either of us intended it, and I'd rather you have the information." He was quiet for a moment. His jaw had tightened slightly, not at her, she could read the direction of it, at the situation. "End of the month," he said. "His letter said so. You told Oakes and Holt both, this morning." He nodded once slowly. What do you need from me? The question was so clean. No offer to take over. No suggestion that she step aside. Just what do you need? She understood in that moment exactly why Mrs. Patton thought so highly of him. If you see strangers, she said, men who ask questions about me or about the schoolhouse or the boarding house, tell me first, then Oaks. Done. And if Gerald Crane arrives... She paused. I need you to let me face him. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression. Not reluctance, not disagreement, but something careful and considered. I'll be there, he said. I just won't be in front of you. That was exactly right. She hadn't expected exactly right. She filed it away in the same place she'd filed the word good, and the way he'd said someone noticed in the part of herself she wasn't looking at directly yet. All right, she said. She bought her chalk and went back to teach the afternoon class, and spent 45 minutes explaining fractions to Tom Briggs, who was outraged by them on principle, and for those 45 minutes she let herself be fully, entirely in that room and nothing else. It was the sanest 45 minutes of the week. The days between that conversation and the end of the month moved with a particular cruelty fast, when she was busy agonizingly slow, when she lay awake at night listening to the house settle. Nothing happened. No strangers. No letters. No shadows on the stairs. The quiet was worse than the noise in some ways. At least noise told you where the threat was. Tom Briggs noticed she was distracted on Thursday, and said with the blunt honesty of an 11-year-old, "You keep looking at the door. I'm watching for late arrivals," she said. "Nobody's late. We're all here." "Tom?" "What?" "Long division, page 12. He went back to the page, but he kept watching her the way children watch adults when they know something is wrong, and nobody will explain it. Clara, from her spot on the right side of the room, looked at Whiskey too, that quiet, attentive look. She had the one that missed nothing. These children deserved better than a teacher whose mind was half elsewhere. She made herself come back fully. She asked Tom to explain his method to the class. He was always better when he was performing, and spent the last hour in a genuine back and forth about numbers that left her tired in a clean way, the kind of tired that comes from doing something that matters. Walking home, she thought, this is what Gerald Crane is actually threatening. Not the land, not the legal status. This. The ability to be here doing this on her own terms. That thought made her angrier than any letter he'd ever sent her. Gerald Crane arrived on a Wednesday. She knew before she saw him. She was walking between the schoolhouse and the general store at noon, when she felt something change in the street's texture, a shift in the way two men near the post office were standing, the way one of them turned and looked at something behind her. She turned. He was heavier than she remembered. The past 2 years had thickened him around the middle and grayed him at the temples, but the eyes were the same, pale and flat and convinced of themselves. He was dressed like money, which meant he'd come prepared to impress a judge. He had a man on each side of him, both of them larger than she was, and positioned in the specific way of men whose job was to make a point without saying it. He saw her the same moment she saw him. He smiled. "Margaret," he said, warm and familial, as if they'd planned to meet here. She didn't move. She didn't step back. She felt the old pull of it, the trained reflex deep in her chest, to apologize, to make herself smaller, to give him something, just to make the moment less dangerous. She'd done it her entire childhood. She'd done it twice in Ohio courtrooms before she'd learned not to. She didn't do it now. "Mr. Crane," she said. Last name. No softness. His smile adjusted, just slightly. "I thought we might talk." "You should speak with my lawyer. Daniel Holt, 2nd Street. "I know where his office is." He took one step toward her. "I meant talk like family, Margaret, just the two of us." "We're not family," she said. "We're opposing parties in a legal proceeding. Anything you say to me without my lawyer present, I'll put in writing and give to the court." She held his gaze. "Good afternoon, Mr. Crane." She turned and walked away. Her heart was hitting her ribs hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. But her back was straight, and her pace was even, and she did not once look behind her. She went directly to Holt's office. "He's here," she said when she walked in. Holt was already standing. "I heard. Oakes sent word 20 minutes ago." He was already pulling papers. "He came to see you. On the street. Tried to get me alone. I referred him to you." "Good, that's exactly right." He looked at her. "How are you?" "Functional," she said. "What happens now?" "Now I go have a conversation with him about the rules of engagement before our hearing. You go back to your normal day." He paused. "And Miss Larson, the fact that you just did what you did in the street in front of witnesses that matters. Half this town just saw Gerald Crane try to corner a woman and watched her redirect him to her lawyer without flinching." She hadn't thought of it that way. "Small towns have long memories," he said. "We're going to need that." Yeah. She went back to school. She finished the afternoon. She walked home. Preston was on the porch of the boarding house. Not lingering, he was standing with Mrs. Patton, clearly in conversation, but when Whiskey came around the corner, he saw her, and whatever he read in her face made him straighten. "He found you on the street," he said. "Yes." She climbed the steps. "I handled it." "I know you did. Oakes told me, said half the street saw it." "Then there's nothing to worry about," she said, and she meant to go inside. She meant to keep moving, but her legs had made a different decision, and she stopped at the top of the steps and stood there, and the day hit her all at once. Not the fear, the exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of 2 years of fighting the same man every time he found a new angle, of always having to be smarter and faster and more documented and more visible and more right than him, always, with no margin for error. Because for her, any mistake was ammunition, and for him, any mistake was just a temporary setback. She pressed her hand against the porch post and breathed. Preston didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He just moved slightly so that he was between her and the street. Not in front of her, just present in a way that was warm without being crowding. After a moment she said, "It's going to be a long 2 weeks until the hearing." "Yes," he said. "He's going to try to rattle me. Find ways to be in the same spaces, make himself unavoidable. It's what he did in Ohio." "He'll find that harder here," Preston said. "This town doesn't like men who use size to substitute for a legal argument." Mrs. Patton, who had been very quiet, said, "I already spoke to Reverend Gaines and Adelaide Patton. Whatever Gerald Crane tells people about you, and they both know what I think of you." She met Whiskey's eyes. "That matters more than you'd think." Whiskey looked at the two of them. This town she'd come to 4 weeks ago knowing nobody. This boarding house she'd walked into off a dark road with $14 and a bad pair of boots. "Thank you," she said, both words fully meant. Mrs. Patton waved her hand in the way of a woman who found gratitude embarrassing. "Go eat something. You look like you haven't since breakfast." Gerald Crane was systematic. She'd always known that about him. Over the following days, he did exactly what she'd predicted appeared, in the same spaces timed to intersect with her routines, always with a pleasant expression and always with his 2 men nearby. He spoke to townspeople. She heard about it from Mrs. Patton. He told people he was here to help his niece settle an estate matter, that Margaret had always been high-strung, that her mother, God rest her, had never been well-suited to managing property. He was constructing a narrative, the same one he'd tried in Ohio. The difference was that in Ohio, he'd had 4 months to build it before she understood what he was doing. Here, he had 2 weeks. And here people had already seen her. Tom Briggs's mother came to the schoolhouse on Friday to tell her that a man well-dressed, very polite, had asked her whether Miss Larson seemed stable. "I told him you were the best teacher this town's had in 3 years, and that my son has learned more in 4 weeks than the whole previous year," she said. "Don't know who he was, but I didn't like the way he was asking." "That's my uncle," Whiskey said. "Thank you for telling me." Mrs. Briggs looked at her for a moment. "You need anything, you come find me. I got 5 brothers in this county, and every one of them thinks highly of Preston Hayes." She went home and added it to the list. The slow, remarkable accumulation of it all, these people who had simply watched her and decided what they saw. The first twist came on the 10th day of Gerald Crane's presence in Redemption Creek. Holt called her into his office with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not alarm. Something more complicated than alarm. "I got the wire back from Ohio," he said. "About John Aldous." She sat down. "And he worked for your uncle twice before. Property disputes both times. In one of them, he posed as a lodger to access correspondence." Holt set the paper on the desk. "Miss Larson, this isn't the first time your uncle has done this." "I assumed as much. There's more." He paused. "The property your mother left you, I had a colleague look at the original deed. Your uncle was a co-signer on a loan against the property in 1869, 7 years ago. Your mother apparently didn't know or didn't fully understand the implications." He held her gaze. "He's not just contesting the will. He believes he has a partial legal claim through that loan." The room was very quiet. "Why didn't the Ohio lawyers find this?" she said. "They may have, or it may have been filed in a secondary county record. Either way..." He stopped. "Either way, he's not wrong that it complicates the picture." She sat with that for a moment. 2 years. She'd fought for 2 years thinking she knew exactly what she was fighting. And he'd had something she hadn't known about. "How bad is it?" she said. "It's not catastrophic, but it means the hearing is more complicated than a straight will dispute." He leaned forward. "It also means I understand now why he's so determined. He's not doing this out of spite alone. He has a financial stake that's real." "He always has a financial stake," she said. "That's never made him right." "No, but it makes him a harder opponent to dismiss." She stood. She walked to the window and stood there with her back to him for a moment, and let herself feel the full weight of it, the way the ground kept shifting every time she thought she had a solid floor under her. Another trapdoor appeared. Her mother had signed something she didn't understand. Her mother, who had trusted her brother once a long time ago and paid for it silently for years. She turned back around. "What do we do?" Holt looked at her with something that was nearly admiration. "We make the loan argument irrelevant by proving the will supersedes it and that the loan was settled before your mother's death. I believe it was. I need a week to verify." He paused. "Can you hold another week?" "I've held 2 years," she said. "I can hold a week." Preston found her at the creek that evening, which she would later think was not a coincidence. He knew her habits now, or was beginning to, in the way people know each other's habits when they've been paying attention. She was sitting on a flat rock above the water, not looking at anything in particular, just existing at the edge of the noise in her head. He sat down nearby without asking, left space between them, looked at the water. After a while she said, "He has a loan document against the property." "Holt told me," he said. "He wanted me to know in case what?" A pause. "In case it changed your plans." She looked at him. "What plans?" He met her gaze. "Staying." The word sat between them, small and enormous at the same time. "I'm not leaving," she said. He nodded once, not surprise, more like a confirmation of something he'd already believed. "All right. I have a hearing in 4 days. My lawyer thinks we can prove the loan was settled. And even if it complicates things..." She stopped. "My mother worked herself to the bone for that land. She signed something she didn't understand because she trusted someone who used that trust against her." She looked back at the water. "I am not giving it up. Not for Gerald Crane. Not for a 7-year-old loan document. Not for anything." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father lost a ranch to a loan document when I was 12. Banker had a clause in it nobody explained until it was too late." She looked at him. "I know what it costs," he said simply. "Watching someone take something that was built by someone who loved you." The quiet between them was different after that. Not the careful quiet of two people who didn't know each other. The quieter quiet of two people who did. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. He told her. Just a little the way he told most things economical, no performance in it. The ranch his father had tried to rebuild in Montana, the land Preston had eventually bought back acre by acre over 8 years. The way it felt to stand on land that was fully yours. She listened. She thought about 40 Ohio acres and a woman named Margaret who'd died before she could see her daughter win. "I'm going to win," she said, quietly, like a promise she was making to someone who wasn't there. "I know," he said. She didn't ask him how he knew. She just let it settle in her chest alongside everything else she was carrying, and for the first time since Gerald Crane had stepped off whatever coach had brought him here, she felt the weight redistribute, not disappear. She wasn't naive enough to want it to disappear. But something about not carrying it entirely alone made the architecture of it feel survivable. 3 days before the hearing, Gerald Crane made his mistake. He went to the schoolhouse. She found out from Tom Briggs, who met her at the door at noon with his chin up and his jaw set in the particular way of a boy who had done something he wasn't sure was right, but was going to defend anyway. "A man came," Tom said, "while you were at the outhouse, asked me questions about you." She went very still. "What kind of questions?" "Whether you seemed nervous lately, whether you'd been acting strange, whether you'd said anything bad about anyone in town." Tom's eyes were direct and hard and oddly adult. "I told him you were the best teacher I ever had, and that if he came back, I'd go get Sheriff Oakes." She looked at this 11-year-old boy who'd come to her class 2 months ago using his intelligence as a weapon against the world, and she felt something move through her chest that she hadn't expected. "You did exactly right," she said. "He described you as high-strung," Tom said with a scorn impressive for his age. "That's what he calls independent women." She put her hand briefly on his shoulder. "Go inside, Tom. Tell the others I'll be 1 more minute." She walked to the corner out of earshot, and she allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of pure, clean fury. The kind of fury that is not hysteria, but its precise opposite, the white-focused anger of a woman who sees clearly. He had gone to her students. He had tried to use children to build his case against her. She walked to Oakes's office. She told him what had happened. She gave him Tom Briggs's name as a witness. Oakes's expression, normally so weathered, and even went somewhere else entirely. "He approached a minor," he said. "He approached one of my students, in the schoolhouse, during school hours." Oakes picked up his hat and stood. "I'll have a word with Mr. Crane," he said. "More than a word," she said. "Put it in a report. I want it documented before the hearing." "Already planning on it?" He paused at the door. "Miss Larson, I've seen a lot of men like your uncle. They push right up until they miscalculate. This was his miscalculation." She went back to school. She taught the afternoon class. Tom Briggs spent the entire time watching her with a protective attention that made her throat ache. When they were dismissed, he gathered his things slowly, the way he did when he had something to say. "Miss Larson," he said. "Tom. Is he going to make you leave?" She looked at him for a long moment. This boy. This entire town that had somehow in 8 weeks built itself into something she had not planned on and could not now imagine leaving. "No," she said. "He is not." Tom Briggs nodded, the kind of nod that is also a decision. "Good," he said and walked out. She stood in the empty classroom in the last afternoon light and pressed both hands flat on the desk and breathed. The hearing was in 3 days. Holt had a case. Oakes had a report. Tom Briggs was a witness she hadn't asked for and couldn't have invented. Gerald Crane had come here thinking she was alone. He had miscalculated badly. She picked up her bag. She locked the schoolhouse door. And she walked back through Redemption Creek, her town, her street, her life, with the absolute certainty that she was going to walk out of that hearing still standing. The night before the hearing, Whiskey didn't sleep. She didn't try to. She sat at the small desk in her room with a candle and her mother's letters, the ones she'd carried in the bottom of her trunk, all the way from Ohio, and she read them slowly, one by one, the way you read something you've already memorized, but need to feel again. Her mother had written in a precise, careful hand. She'd been a school teacher too before she married, and the letters had that quality, organized thoughts, exact words, nothing wasted. But under the precision was something else, something that Whiskey had only fully understood after her mother died. A woman who had spent her life being careful because careful was the only armor she'd been allowed. One letter from 3 years ago read, "Gerald came by again. I told him the deed is mine, and I intend to leave it as I see fit. He didn't argue with me directly. He never does, but I could see it in his face. He doesn't believe I have the right. He has never believed it. I think he never will." Whiskey folded the letter and held it in both hands. Her mother had known, had seen it clearly, had been careful and precise and correct about every single thing, and had still died before she could watch her daughter win. "I'm going to win it for both of us," she said to the room to no one. The words felt strange out loud. They also felt true. She put the letters away, blew out the candle, and lay down in the dark. She didn't sleep, but she rested. There was a difference, and tonight the difference was enough. The territorial courthouse in Redemption Creek was a single room in the back of the municipal building, with 6 rows of benches and a judge's bench that someone had built slightly too high, so that Judge Aldrich Bowen looked down at everything from a permanent elevation that he either didn't notice or enjoyed. Whiskey arrived 20 minutes early with Daniel Holt, who had a leather satchel that appeared to contain approximately every document ever filed in the state of Montana. He'd been in early preparation mode for 3 days, short sentences, direct eye contact, the focused calm of a man who had prepared past the point of doubt. "Don't speak unless I ask you to," he said for the 4th time since breakfast. "I know," she said. "If Crane tries to address you directly, I look at you, not him. And if the judge asks you a question, I answer the question that was asked, exactly that question, nothing extra." Holt looked at her. "You've done this before." "Twice," she said, "and lost neither time." He nodded. They went in. Gerald Crane was already seated at the opposing table with a lawyer she didn't recognize. A man from outside Redemption Creek, she noted, which meant her uncle had imported him. The man had the particular self-assurance of a city lawyer who considered territorial courts a minor inconvenience, and he'd arranged his papers with the deliberate display of someone who wanted the room to see how many papers he had. Crane looked at her when she walked in. She looked at the judge's bench. The benches behind the bar filled up quickly. She hadn't expected that. She'd assumed the hearing would be sparsely attended legal proceedings in small towns usually were. But when she turned briefly, she saw Mrs. Patton in the 2nd row, and Tom Briggs's mother beside her, and Reverend Gaines on the end, and 2 other women she recognized from the church social, and 3 ranchers she knew by face, if not name, and in the back row near the door, Preston Hayes hat in hand, sitting straight. He didn't nod at her. He didn't make any gesture at all. He was just there the way he'd said he would be present, not in front of her. She faced forward. Judge Bowen opened the proceedings with the efficient brevity of a man who had a full calendar and no patience for theater. Gerald Crane's lawyer. His name was Whitfield, and he said it like a credential opened with the loan document. He laid it out cleanly, a co-signed loan against the property in 1869, executed between Gerald Crane and Whiskey's mother, Catherine Larson. The loan had been for $300. Whitfield argued that the loan represented a standing legal claim against the property that superseded the terms of the will. Whiskey kept her hands flat on the table and her expression neutral. Holt let him finish. Then he stood. "Mr. Whitfield has presented a loan document," Holt said. "We don't dispute the document exists." He opened his satchel. "What we dispute is Mr. Whitfield's claim that the loan was never settled." He put a paper on the judge's desk. "This is a receipt of payment dated March 14, 1872, signed by Gerald Crane, acknowledging full repayment of the $300 loan with interest. Notarized by a Columbus, Ohio clerk, whose stamp is visible at the bottom." Holt paused. "The loan was settled 7 years ago, Your Honor. Mr. Crane's own signature confirms it." The room was quiet. Whiskey watched Gerald Crane's face. For a fraction of a second, just a fraction, something moved through it. Not shock. Something older than shock. The expression of a man who had been caught doing something he'd convinced himself was invisible. Then his face smoothed back into certainty, and he leaned toward Whitfield and said something low. Whitfield stood. "Your Honor, we would request time to examine." "You've had time," Judge Bowen said. "Mr. Holt, proceed." Holt proceeded. He walked through the will clear, properly witnessed filed in 2 Ohio counties. He walked through the 2 previous Ohio filings, and their outcomes both dismissed in Whiskey's favor. He introduced Oakes's report about Gerald Crane approaching a minor student at the schoolhouse. He introduced the opened and resealed letter as evidence of mail tampering. He introduced the documented record of John Aldous, who had posed as a lodger at the boarding house and had a documented history of working for Gerald Crane in 2 prior property disputes. Each document landed like a stone dropped in still water. Whitfield objected 4 times. Bowen overruled 3 of them and sustained 1 on a technicality that Holt absorbed without breaking stride. Then Whitfield stood for his client's argument and said the word unstable. Whiskey had known it was coming. She'd known since Ohio. And still the word landed in her chest with a weight that made her want to push back from the table. She didn't move. Whitfield said that Margaret Larson had abandoned her property, had left the state, had no fixed permanent address, prior to her current employment, had no husband or male guardian to speak to her interests. Holt's pen scratched an objection note, and that, in his client's considered view, a woman without the stability of family or fixed roots could not be considered a competent steward of inherited land. When he said considered view, Holt stood up. "Your Honor," Holt said, and his voice had changed. Calm had hardened into something precise and cold. "Mr. Whitfield has just argued that a woman cannot own property because she is unmarried and employed in a different state. I would invite the court to consider that Miss Larson's employment is documented. Her salary is on record. Her professional conduct has been observed by every resident of this town who cares to speak to it." He gestured to the benches behind him, a single deliberate gesture, and that the Married Women's Property Act passed in Ohio in 1861 explicitly recognizes a woman's right to hold property in her own name independent of marital status. The concept of male guardianship as a legal requirement for property ownership is not only outdated, Your Honor. It is not the law. The bench behind her had gone very quiet, in the particular way a room goes quiet when it is paying total attention. Judge Bowen looked at Whitfield. "Counsel." Whitfield adjusted his papers. "Your Honor, we maintain that the circumstances of Miss Larson's departure from Ohio, the circumstances of her departure," Holt said, "were a job offer and a legal right to relocate, which is the same right enjoyed by every man in this courtroom without his character being called into question." Someone in the benches made a sound, not loud, just present. Bowen's expression was unreadable. He looked at the documents in front of him for a long moment. Then he looked up. "Mr. Crane," he said. Gerald Crane stood, and for the first time standing in front of a man looking down at him from a bench slightly too high, he looked like what he was, a man whose argument had run out of road. "Yes, Your Honor." "You signed this receipt in 1872. Your Honor, there may have been a misunderstanding about the terms." "The terms are printed clearly on the document," Bowen said. "Your signature is at the bottom. A notary witnessed it." He set the paper down. "Do you dispute that this is your signature?" A pause that lasted 3 full seconds. "No," Gerald Crane said. The word fell into the room like something final. Bowen called a 30-minute recess. Holt said nothing during it. He sat with his hands on the table and his eyes slightly unfocused, the look of a man running through scenarios. Whiskey sat beside him and looked at the wall and breathed. Mrs. Patton appeared at the rail and reached over and squeezed her hand once tight, and then went back to her seat without saying a word. When Bowen returned, he didn't take long. He ruled the loan claim invalid, settled debt documented by the claimant's own signature. He ruled the will properly executed, and the property rights clearly established under Ohio law. He dismissed Gerald Crane's petition with prejudice, which Holt had told her meant it could not be refiled in the same form. He added a notation regarding the mail tampering that he said would be forwarded to the federal marshal's office. Then he looked at Gerald Crane directly and said, "Mr. Crane, I am going to say something outside the formal ruling, and you would do well to hear it. This court has reviewed 3 separate legal actions brought by you against the same woman over the same property across 2 years. The pattern of conduct, the surveillance, the use of intermediaries. The approach to a minor child suggests that this is less a property dispute and more a campaign of harassment. I am not in a position to rule on that today. But I want you to understand clearly, if this court sees your name on another filing against Miss Larson, it will examine the full history of your conduct with considerably less patience than I have shown today." The room was still. Gerald Crane said nothing. Bowen brought down the gavel. She didn't cry. She'd promised herself she wouldn't, and she held to that through the formal close of the proceedings, through shaking Holt's hand through the moment Whitfield gathered his papers with the tight contained manner of a man processing a loss he hadn't planned for. Gerald Crane walked past her on the way out. He paused. Just for a second. "Margaret," he said low private, the way he'd said everything for 26 years. Like the world between them was a family matter, and family matters didn't have witnesses. She turned and looked at him fully. "Mr. Crane, my lawyer's name is Daniel Holt, 2nd Street. If you have anything further to say to me, you can say it to him." She held his gaze. He left. She turned back to the room, and that was when she let herself look at the benches, at the people still sitting there. Mrs. Patton, her eyes bright. Tom's mother gripping her hands in her lap. Reverend Gaines with something quietly satisfied in his expression, and something unlocked in her chest that she hadn't realized had been closed for 2 years. Preston was no longer in the back row. She looked and didn't find him, and something dropped in her stomach before she checked the doorway, and found him there, leaning against the frame waiting. She walked toward him. People touched her arm as she passed small touches brief and warm, and she accepted each one because she understood now what they were: not charity, not pity, recognition. She reached the doorway. He looked at her for a moment. "You won," he said. "We won," she said. "This town won it with me." He shook his head slightly. "No, you built this." He meant it. She could see that he meant it. "We just showed up." She stood in the doorway and looked at this man and thought about the dark road 4 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago now, and the creek information and the word good and the way he sat his horse slightly behind her so she could see what was coming. All of it. The accumulation of it. "Preston," she said. "Yeah. Thank you. For all of it, not just today." He looked at her in the way he looked at things he was being careful with. "It was easy," he said quietly. "You make it easy." She didn't know exactly what he meant by that, but she felt it land in a place that had been empty for a long time. The celebration, such as it was, happened at Mrs. Patton's kitchen table, which was exactly right. Mrs. Patton produced a pie that she'd clearly baked in anticipation, and Holt arrived with 2 bottles of something that turned out to be a very decent whiskey, which he poured without irony, and Preston sat at the table across from whiskey and ate pie and said very little and was entirely solidly present. Tom Briggs knocked on the back door at some point, which should have been impossible since school was still technically in session, and Whiskey opened the door and looked at him. "I heard," he said. "Who told you? My ma sent word." He looked at her with the direct, unguarded look he only showed when he thought nobody would notice. "You okay?" "Yes," she said. "Tom, go back to school." "You sure you're—" "Tom." He went. She watched him go and pressed her lips together very firmly. She went back to the table and sat down and ate her pie and let herself feel fully, and without armor, the particular warmth of being surrounded by people who had chosen her. The aftermath of winning was quieter than she'd expected. She'd thought in the abstract during those sleepless nights leading up to the hearing that victory would feel like something dramatic. A door swinging open, a sudden expansion of air. But what it actually felt like was more like the end of a long storm, Not an arrival, but an absence. The constant low pressure of the past 2 years simply stopped. She graded papers in the evenings without checking the door. She walked to school and back without cataloging strangers. She slept through the night. The first time she slept entirely through the night, she woke up and lay there for a moment disoriented, and then understood what was different, and the understanding was so large and so quiet that she lay with it for a long time before she got up. Gerald Crane left Redemption Creek the day after the hearing without speaking to anyone. Holt confirmed it. Oakes had watched him board a coach heading east Whitfield, alongside him, both of them, with the compressed energy of men who intended to pretend this had not happened. The federal marshal's office sent an inquiry about the mail tampering a week later. Holt handled it. John Aldous was located in Wyoming and questioned. The investigation was ongoing, which meant Gerald Crane was no longer simply looking over his shoulder at Montana. He had a federal inquiry to manage in Ohio. "He's going to leave you alone for a while," Holt told her, "possibly for good." "Not for good," she said. She knew Gerald Crane too well for that. "Maybe not, but you've made yourself more expensive than you're worth to him legally and reputationally." He paused. "And the next judge who hears his name will have this ruling in front of them before he says a word." That was real. That was permanent. Whatever he tried next, he would be trying it against a documented record that showed exactly who he was. She thanked Holt. She paid his invoice half from savings, half on a payment plan he'd offered, without being asked, because he was, as Mrs. Patton had said, genuinely good. Life reassembled itself around her in the way she'd intended when she'd first taken the position. The children, the classroom, the rhythm of the school day. Clara, who had started staying after class sometimes to practice reading aloud, whose progress in the past 6 weeks had been real and steady and moving in a way that Whiskey couldn't always let herself show. Tom Briggs, who had stopped arriving to class with his chin already up in a defensive posture and had started arriving simply as himself, which was better than the posture by a considerable margin. Adelaide Patton, the school board woman who had left walking fast after their first conversation, came back 3 weeks post-hearing and told Whiskey she had put in an order for the new flu. She said it without apology for the delay and without acknowledgement that it should have been done sooner, and Whiskey accepted it in the same spirit, because the flu was what mattered, not the acknowledgement. "The board has reviewed your employment through June," Adelaide added. "I assumed they had," Whiskey said. "It's been approved." "Good," she said in the same tone Preston used the word, and she watched Adelaide Patton process that, and leave with something slightly altered in her expression. She told Mrs. Patton about it at supper, and Mrs. Patton laughed until she had to set down her fork. She and Preston fell into each other's company, the way water falls not by decision, but by the natural direction of things. He rode past the schoolhouse most evenings on his way back from town, and she was usually locking up at roughly the same time, and they walked the same direction for half a block before his way, and hers diverged, and those half-block stretches became something she noticed when they didn't happen. He asked about her students and listened to the answers. He told her things about the ranch, small things, specific things. The kind of detail that means a person trusts you with ordinary life rather than just the dramatic version of it. A fence line that needed fixing. A horse that had been difficult. A yield problem in the north pasture that he'd been troubleshooting for 2 months. She gave him her full attention, and he gave her his, and the conversation between them was one of the easiest she'd had in years, which told her something she was slowly becoming willing to look at. One evening, he said without particular preamble, "I'd like to show you the ranch sometime, if you'd want to see it." She considered it for a moment. Not the ranch itself, the weight of the invitation. The specificity of it. "My place. Come see what I've built." "Saturday," she said. "Saturday," he agreed. Why? The ranch was 8 years of his hands. She understood that the moment she arrived, not from what she saw, but from what she felt. The way he moved through it, the ease and the ownership in every gesture, the way he introduced her to his foreman Caleb, with a quiet naturalness that suggested he'd thought about this before she arrived. The way he pointed out the north fence line he'd been working on showed her the problem. He'd been troubleshooting in the pasture, talked about the land. The way she'd heard very few people talk about anything like it, mattered, like it was real, like it was worth being careful with. She walked alongside him and thought about 40 Ohio acres and a deed with her name on it, and she thought about what it meant to fight for something not because of its size, but because of whose hands had shaped it. "Your father would have been pleased," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." They stood looking at the north pasture, and the summer heat pressed down over everything, and somewhere a meadowlark went through its whole call twice. "This is what I was fighting for," she said quietly. "Not the land exactly. The right to have land. The right to stand somewhere and say this is mine and have it mean something." He turned and looked at her. "My mother stood in her kitchen every day for 20 years, she said, and she never once said out loud that the house was hers, that the land was hers, that her life was hers. Because every time she tried to say it, someone reminded her that legally, practically, according to the way the world was organized, it wasn't. Not entirely." She paused. "She left it to me in a will because she wanted me to say it. She wanted me to say it out loud without apologizing." Preston said nothing. He was listening with his whole attention the way he did. "So that's what I'm doing," she said. "I'm saying it out loud." She looked at him. "This land is mine. My land in Ohio is mine. My classroom is mine. My life is mine." He looked at her for a long moment. "It is," he said, simply, completely, like it was not in question. She breathed in the summer air, and the meadowlark went through its call a third time, and she felt the full weight of 2 years lift from her shoulders and become something she carried differently. Not gone, but no longer the heaviest thing she owned. The twist came not from Gerald Crane. It came from Holt's office 2 weeks after the hearing on a Tuesday afternoon when the children had gone home and she was cleaning the chalkboard. Holt appeared at the schoolhouse door. She turned at his footsteps and read his face immediately. "What happened?" she said. Not a question. "Sit down," he said. "Daniel? Please." She sat. He put a paper on the desk in front of her. Not a legal document, a letter. She looked at the return address. Columbus, Ohio. The county recorder's office. She picked it up and read it. When she finished, she set it down very slowly. "There's a second property," she said. "Yes," Holt said. "My mother owned a second property, a lot on the edge of Columbus, small. She bought it in 1868 under her own name before your father died, before Gerald Crane became involved in her finances." He paused. "It was never listed in the contested estate because no one knew about it. Gerald Crane didn't know. The Ohio lawyers didn't know. It was filed under her maiden name, Catherine Pierce, her mother's name before she became Catherine Larson. "It's yours," Holt said. "Clean title, no liens, no disputes. The county recorder found it during the federal inquiry into Crane's activities. They pulled her full property record as part of the investigation." He paused. "Your mother hid it, Miss Larson. She bought it quietly and filed it quietly and kept it separate from everything your uncle could touch, and she never told anyone." Whiskey sat with that for a very long time. Her mother, precise and careful and quiet with her organized thoughts and her exact words, and her letter that said Gerald came by again, and the 20 years of being careful, because careful was the only armor she'd been allowed. Her mother had kept a secret. A good one, a fierce one. She'd had more armor than anyone knew. Whiskey pressed her hand over her mouth and let herself feel it. The grief and the joy and the pride, all at once, the full and complicated truth of loving someone who was gone and still being surprised by them. "What do I do with it?" she asked when she trusted her voice. "Whatever you want," Holt said simply. "It's yours." She sat in the empty classroom in the afternoon light with her mother's hidden lot, and her one land, and her 8 weeks of life in Redemption Creek, and the particular knowledge that things could be saved in ways you didn't know about until you needed them. Then she stood up, squared her shoulders, and walked out to find Preston Hayes. She had something she wanted to tell him. She found him at the livery stable talking to Caleb about something involving the north fence line and a delivery that had come in late. He saw her coming from across the yard, and whatever was in her face made him stop mid-sentence. Caleb looked between them, had the good sense to find something else requiring his attention, and walked away without being asked. "Something happened," Preston said. "Something good," she said. "I think. I'm still deciding how to feel about it." He waited. He was always good at waiting. She told him about the letter, about Catherine Pierce and the Columbus lot and the hidden property her mother had kept separate from everything Gerald Crane could touch. She told it plainly, the way she told most things, but her voice caught once, just once at the part about her mother filing it under her maiden name, and she felt Preston register it without making anything of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "She was protecting you," he said. "She was protecting herself first," Whiskey said. "And then me, for years, without ever saying so." "That's the harder kind of strength," he said. "The kind nobody sees." She looked at him. The summer evening was settling over everything she could feel the day's heat, starting to give the particular hour when Montana air finally relents. "I've been thinking about that," she said. "My whole life, I thought I was the stubborn one, the difficult one. Gerald Crane always said my mother was gentle and I'd gotten the hard edges." She paused. "But she bought a lot under her maiden name and filed it quietly, and kept the secret for 8 years and never told a soul." "Doesn't sound gentle to me," Preston said. "No," she said. "It doesn't." She breathed out slowly. "I think I've been angry at her for being careful, for not fighting the way I fight." She stopped. "I think I was wrong." He looked at her steadily. "You weren't wrong. You just didn't have all the information." "That's a generous reading." "It's an honest one." She stood there in the last of the evening light and felt something she hadn't expected. Not grief exactly, but something that moved through grief and came out the other side into something cleaner. Her mother had been fighting all along, just quietly, just in the way she had available to her. "I'm going to keep the lot," Whiskey said. "I don't know what I'll do with it yet, but I'm keeping it." "Course you are," he said, as if this was never in question. She almost smiled. "Thank you," she said, "for listening." "Easy thing to do," he said, "when it's worth listening to." 3 days later, Adelaide Patton called an emergency school board meeting. Whiskey heard about it from Mrs. Patton at breakfast, not the content of the meeting, just the fact of it, which Mrs. Patton relayed with a careful expression that told Whiskey the content was something she needed to prepare for. "Who called it?" Whiskey asked. "Adelaide." Mrs. Patton hesitated. "There was a letter from Ohio. A man, I don't know his name, apparently wrote to the board suggesting that your conduct during the legal proceedings had been his word was unseemly, that a woman of appropriate character wouldn't have required a public court hearing." Whiskey set down her coffee cup. "Adelaide called the meeting," Mrs. Patton continued carefully. "But I don't think she called it for the reason you're thinking. Reverend Gaines was there last night. He told me—" "When is it?" Whiskey said. "This afternoon, 4 o'clock. She taught the morning class. She taught it well. Tom Briggs was working on essay composition, and she'd given him a prompt about a man who thought he was right about something and wasn't, which she regretted slightly, given his tendency to identify every assignment as personal. But he was writing with genuine focus, and she let it stand. At noon, she went to Holt's office. He already had a copy of the letter. Whitfield had sent it. Gerald Crane's imported lawyer, apparently not finished, after all, apparently willing to try a different avenue now that the legal one had closed. "He can't touch your job from Ohio," Holt said. "The board hired you under territorial employment terms. A letter from a private citizen carries no legal weight." "I know it carries no legal weight," she said. "I'm concerned about what it carries socially." Holt was quiet for a moment. "Miss Larson, how many people came to that hearing?" She looked at him. "Count them," he said. "And then consider whether a letter from Whitfield changes what those people already decided about you." She arrived at the school board meeting at 3:55. The room held 7 people, Adelaide Patton at the head of the table, 3 other board members she recognized, Reverend Gaines, and to her slight surprise, Tom Briggs's mother and another woman from the church social whose name she was still learning. Adelaide looked up when she walked in. Whatever she'd expected, she looked slightly startled to see Whiskey standing there with her coat buttoned and her hands loose at her sides. "Miss Larson," Adelaide said, "this meeting isn't—" "I understand it concerns my conduct," Whiskey said. "I thought it appropriate to be present." She looked around the table. "Unless the board prefers to discuss me without me." A short silence. "Sit down," said one of the board members. A farmer named Howard Wells, a man she'd seen twice and spoken to once. He said it matter-of-factly, gesturing to an empty chair, and she sat. Adelaide read the letter aloud. All of it. Whiskey listened without expression. Whitfield had been thorough. He'd called the hearing, a spectacle called her testimony. Aggressive, called the community support orchestrated, suggested that a schoolteacher who attracted this manner of legal controversy was a poor influence on children. When Adelaide finished, the room was quiet. Then Tom's mother said, "That man never set foot in a classroom in this town." "He certainly never talked to my Tom," said the other woman. "Because I'd have heard about it." Reverend Gaines folded his hands on the table. "In 30 years of ministry, I have found that the letters written about a person by their opponents tell you considerably more about the opponent than the person." He looked at Adelaide. "I believe we called this meeting to vote." Adelaide set the letter down. She looked at Whiskey for a moment, and Whiskey looked back and gave her nothing to read, just steadiness, just presence. "The board votes on continued employment," Adelaide said. "All in favor." 5 hands, all of them. Adelaide's was the last one, and it went up fully without hesitation. "Motion carries," she said. She folded the letter and put it in the bottom of the pile. "I'll send a response to this Mr. Whitfield. He'll be informed that his letter was reviewed and that the board considers the matter closed." She looked at Whiskey. "We expect you back in the classroom Monday." "I haven't left," Whiskey said. Adelaide almost smiled. Almost. "No," she said, "you haven't." She told Preston about it that evening on the half-block walk they'd both stopped pretending was accidental. He listened. When she finished, he said, "Whitfield won't try again." "How do you know?" "Because he's a city lawyer who tried a rural social maneuver and got 5 votes against him in a room full of people who watched you win a courtroom fight. He knows now he's out of his territory." He paused. "Men like that don't like losing where people can see it." "Gerald Crane does," she said. "Gerald Crane is different. He's personal." He glanced at her. "You think he'll try again?" "I think he'll try again differently, quietly. In 2 years, maybe 3, when he thinks I've stopped watching." She exhaled. "I'll be watching." "I know," Preston said, and the way he said it, not as comfort, not as reassurance, but as a simple statement of fact about who she was, made something in her chest turn over quietly. They reached the place where the road split. His way right, hers left. They'd stood here enough times now that there was a familiarity to it, a ritual almost the pause before the separate directions. He didn't take his direction. He stood there for a moment, hat in hand, looking at something above the main street, and she could tell there was something he was deciding. "Whiskey," he said. It was the first time he'd used that name. Not Miss Larson, her name. The one that had stuck because it was more honest than the one she'd been born with. She turned and looked at him. "I'm not good at this," he said. "Saying things directly when they matter. I'm better with actions, with showing up." He stopped. "But I've been told that sometimes showing up isn't enough, and the words have to come too." She waited. "I'd like to court you," he said. "Properly, if that's something you'd want." The evening had gone completely still around them. Or maybe she'd just stopped hearing it. She looked at this man, 8 years of a ranch built back acre by acre, the way he sat his horse slightly behind her on a dark road. What do you need the word good, standing in a courtroom doorway with his hat in his hand? I need you to understand something first, she said. All right. The land stays mine. The job stays mine. My name stays mine. She held his gaze. If I build something with someone, it's because I chose to. Not because the law says I have to. Not because it's expected. Not because I need protecting. He looked at her steadily. I know that. I mean it. I know you mean it? He paused. I wouldn't want it any other way. A woman who needs me to carry things for her when she can carry them herself is... He stopped. That's not what I want. That's never been what I want. What do you want? She said. Someone worth standing next to, he said. Someone who stands back. She was quiet for a moment. The summer dark was coming in soft and warm, and the main street of Redemption Creek was carrying its usual evening sounds, a door, a horse, someone laughing 2 buildings over. I'd like that too, she said. The standing next to part. He breathed out slowly. Something in his shoulders settled, not relief exactly, more like the easing of a thing held carefully for a long time. Saturday, he said. Supper. Not at Mrs. Patton's because she'll listen through the wall. Despite everything, she laughed. Genuine, unguarded, the kind of laugh that surprised her. She absolutely will. I know a place, he said. All right, she said. Saturday. The twist came not from Gerald Crane. It came from a letter postmarked Columbus, Ohio, arriving on a Friday morning 9 weeks into her life in Redemption Creek, written in a hand she didn't recognize. The return address was a law firm. Not Whitfield, a different one. She opened it at the kitchen table with Mrs. Patton pretending to do something else on the other side of the room. It was from a lawyer named Edmund Cross, who identified himself as having been retained by the executor of an estate. The letter said that a man named Harold Briggs, no relation to Tom, she checked immediately, had died in Columbus 6 weeks prior, and had left a written statement to his lawyer that he wished to be transmitted to Margaret Larson of Redemption Creek, Montana. She stared at that sentence for a moment. She did not know Harold Briggs. She read on. Harold Briggs had been a notary in Columbus for 30 years. He had notarized in 1872 a receipt of payment between Gerald Crane and Catherine Larson. He had also, unknown to anyone, kept a private copy of a second document signed that same day, a document in which Gerald Crane had explicitly acknowledged that the loan was paid in full and that he relinquished all claim to Catherine Larson's property in perpetuity. The word perpetuity was underlined. Briggs had kept it because he was a careful man. He'd kept it because something about Gerald Crane had made him uneasy that day, and he'd thought a copy might be needed. He'd kept it for 22 years and never been asked about it, and now he was dead, and his conscience apparently had outlasted him. Enclosed in the letter was a certified copy of the document. Gerald Crane's signature at the bottom. Notarized. Witnessed. If this document had existed in an Ohio courtroom 2 years ago, the first filing would have been dismissed in an hour. She sat at the kitchen table and held the letter, and thought about all of it, all 2 years of it. Every court date, every letter, every sleepless night, every moment she'd stood across from Gerald Crane and felt the weight of everything stacked against her. All of it had been unnecessary. The answer had been sitting in a notary's file cabinet in Columbus for 2 decades. She breathed. Then she breathed again. Then she said calmly to the room, Mrs. Patton, I need to take this to Holt. Mrs. Patton turned from the counter. She read Whiskey's face. What is it? It's over, Whiskey said. It's genuinely, completely over. Holt read the document twice. Then he set it on the desk and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he said with the precision of a man who usually chose words carefully, That is the cleanest thing I've seen in 10 years of territorial law. What does it mean practically? She said. It means that if Gerald Crane ever files anything anywhere against you or your mother's estate again, this document ends it before it starts. Not wins it, ends it. He looked at her. He signed away his claim completely, in his own hand, before a notary. This isn't leverage, Miss Larson. This is a door that closes permanently. She sat with that. Permanent. The word felt large and real and quiet. I want a copy filed in Ohio-Montana Territorial Court, and with Holt's office, she said. All three. I'll do it today. She stood. She picked up the letter. She held it for a moment. A man I never met kept this for 22 years, she said. Some people carry things until they can put them down, Holt said. He put it down. She nodded. She didn't trust herself to say anything else about Harold Briggs, so she said nothing. Honk. She told Preston at supper, which happened not at the restaurant he'd intended, but at the ranch because a summer storm came through Saturday afternoon and made the road impractical, and he'd sent Caleb with a horse and a message that said simply, if you're willing. Kitchen's warm. She'd been willing. Caleb, who had the social grace to make himself useful elsewhere, the moment she arrived produced a meal that suggested he had been given specific instructions and had taken them seriously and then disappeared. She and Preston sat at the kitchen table and ate, and she told him about Harold Briggs and the document, and he listened with his full attention the way he always did, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. It's done, he said. It's done, she said. He looked at her. How do you feel? Nobody had asked her that. Holt had given her the legal analysis. Mrs. Patton had expressed something between triumph and relief. But Preston was asking how she felt, which was a different question entirely. She thought about it honestly. Like I've been running for 2 years and I just stopped, she said. And the stopping is almost harder than the running. Yeah, he said, like he knew exactly what that was. I keep waiting for the next thing, she said. The next letter, the next filing, the next angle. She pressed her hands flat on the table. And there isn't one. Takes time, he said. To believe the quiet. She looked at him. How long did it take you after you got the ranch back? He thought about it. 2 years, maybe. To stop doing the accounting at night. To stop adding up what could still go wrong. He paused. Then one morning I just didn't. Did something change? I stopped being alone in it, he said simply. The kitchen was warm, and the storm was moving through outside, and she could hear the rain against the roof in that particular summer storm rhythm. And she sat across from this man who had sat slightly behind her on a dark road and tracked the way she walked on a damaged heel and stood in a courthouse doorway with his hat in his hand. And she understood with complete clarity that she had stopped being alone in it too. She wasn't sure exactly when it had happened. She wasn't sure it had happened in a single moment. Some things built the way buildings build. One day it's foundation, another day it's walls, and then at some point you look up and it's a house and you don't know when it became one. Preston, she said. Yeah. I'd like to stay, tonight. I mean, she stopped. The storm. I know what you mean, he said. He wasn't making it difficult. He wasn't making it anything other than what it was, a woman saying she'd like to stay somewhere safe, and a man hearing her. There's a room. It's yours. Thank you. Course. In the morning the storm had cleared and the world was washed, and the light was the particular light that comes after summer rain, sharper than usual, each thing more itself. She stood on the porch of Preston Hayes's ranch and looked at the Montana morning, and felt what could only be described as a fundamental rightness. Not happiness in the uncomplicated sense, she was not an uncomplicated woman and never had been, but something more durable than happiness, something that knew itself. Preston came out and stood beside her. He handed her a cup of coffee without asking. She took it. I want to ask you something, he said. She waited. Not today, he said. Not now. I'm not asking now. He paused. I just want you to know that I intend to ask, so you can think about it without being surprised. She looked at him. That's a very particular way of not asking something. I've been told I'm too slow, he said. I'm trying to be less slow without being reckless. She felt something move through her chest, that warm, untidy thing she'd been carefully not naming for 8 weeks. "Ask it," she said, "when you're ready." "I'm not done being ready yet." "Preston?" "I want to do it right," he said, and she could hear in his voice that he meant it completely. "You've been fought over by a man who thought he had a right to your future. I want to ask about your future in a way that has nothing to do with rights." She stood with that for a long moment. "That," she said quietly, "is exactly the right thing to say." He asked her 6 weeks later. Not formally, not with performance, not in front of anyone. They were walking the north fence line of the ranch, a habit now part of the rhythm of her Saturdays, and he stopped, and she stopped, and he looked at her and said, "Whiskey, will you stay?" She understood the full weight of it. Stay. Not be mine. Not marry me in the formal transactional sense. Just stay. Here. In this place. With me. "Yes," she said. He breathed out. One long, slow breath. "I want my name," she said. "On both properties and at school and everywhere else." "Yes," he said without pause. "And I want it understood that I stay because I choose to. Every day." "Every day," he agreed. "And if Tom Briggs gives you trouble at some point, which he will, you come to me first." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, but the thing underneath a smile. "Yes, ma'am." "All right," she said. "Then yes." They married in September, when the summer heat had finally given way to the first cool edges of fall, in a ceremony that Reverend Gaines conducted with the simple warmth of a man marrying 2 people he approved of. Mrs. Patton cried and denied it. Tom Briggs sat in the front row with Clara, and looked like he intended to take credit for all of it eventually. Holt stood in the back with Oakes, and both of them wore the expression of men who had done their part and were satisfied. The vows were short and exact, the way she liked things, the way she'd lived since she was old enough to understand that precision was its own kind of freedom. She said them looking at Preston Hayes, who said them looking at her, and neither of them looked away. Afterward, when the small gathering had eaten Mrs. Patton's considerable food, and the evening had come in soft and cool, she stood with Preston on the porch of what was now their ranch, and looked at the Montana sky, and thought about everything that had brought her to this particular place, on this particular night. A stagecoach that didn't slow down. A dark road. A man on horseback who told her about creek crossings without being condescending about it. $14 in her hem, and a letter of employment, and a mother who'd hidden a lot under her maiden name, and kept the secret for 8 years. She thought about every courtroom, and every letter, and every sleepless night, and every moment she'd stood across from Gerald Crane, and refused to make herself smaller. She thought about the choice she'd made day after day to stay. "You're quiet," Preston said. "I'm thinking," she said. "About what?" She looked at the sky for another moment. Then she looked at him. This man, this land, this life she had built on her own terms with her own hands in her own name. "About how I'd do all of it again," she said. "Every hard part, every letter, every court date." She paused. "Because it brought me here." He took her hand, easy and sure the way he did most things. She looked back at the Montana sky and felt the cool air and the solid ground under her feet and the weight of everything she owned. 2 properties, 1 job, 1 name, 1 man who knew the difference between standing in front and standing beside. Margaret Larson had left Ohio with $14 and a bad pair of boots. She had arrived.